wanting to know whether we are going to recording. We are recording. That's very exciting. We did ask people to please watch the recording of the conversation between Owen Jones and Andrew, but we know that many people got the invitation today and probably didn't have a chance. So to start us off, I'm going to ask Andrew to tell us a little bit about himself and his background and why this conflict is so important in your life as a Jew born in South Africa. And for those of you who don't know, who was also a member of parliament with Nelson Mandela in the early 90s. So Andrew, just a little bit of background about yourself.
Yeah, so first of all, Louise, thank you so much for the invitation. It really is great to be here with you all. And having spent the day, as we were talking to various media in the UK and around the world, it just feels far more appropriate to be having this longer and more meaningful conversation with fellow South Africans, because I do think it is a proud day. It's a difficult issue to talk about. As some of you might know, my father was South African, my mom was Austrian. I grew up between Cape Town and Vienna in Austria. By the time I was 12, we had what my sister and I called semigrated 6 times. So my father would come home on a Thursday night and he'd say, I can't live under apartheid anymore. We're going to live in, and it was Vienna, Salzburg, London, The Hague, and off we'd go. And my poor mother was expected just to pack everything up and off we'd go. But the advantage of that, I went to 12 primary schools. The only advantage of that was at a time, and you know, those of my vintage, I'm 2 months away from my 60th birthday. We grew up in a racist state, but a state in which the news was incredibly heavily censored, where to show an image of Nelson Mandela, let alone the words of Mandela, could land you in jail for many, many years if you survived the torture that would probably come before it. And by growing up in other societies as well, I was able to learn more about my own country from the outside than I could often learn inside, absurdly. And, you know, when I realized that people who weren't the same color as me, and, you know, I have huge problems, I must be honest with you, using the sort of racial nomenclature of apartheid, but it's part of the way we understand a lot about South Africa. And you know, my daughter, who's in her final year of university at the moment, is writing a thesis about 1980s politics in South Africa. And when she talks to me, she says, she doesn't say as a white person, she says, as a pink person. Because she says, you don't look white, you're pink. Why do they have all these laws that favored all the white people when most of you are pink, or some of you are actually sunburned and look red, and some of you are brown, and you know, what difference does the color of your skin make? And that's the joy of having children who were described by the Mail and Guardian when I was still in Parliament as South Africa's first Muslims, because my wife is Muslim. She's Bangladeshi. We met at university when I had to leave South Africa in the mid-1980s for a few years. But so I was advantaged in that I could see South Africa as people on the outside saw it as well from a very young age. But as important as that was in South Africa, my mom was very involved with something called the Black Sash. So these were women who would protest at busy street corners and intersections of a morning against the worst iniquities of the apartheid system. And, you know, as I got sort of politically conscious, which my Jewish mother, who's much like her having a Bangladeshi mother-in-law, you know, my mom says that I read a book called The Mind of Adolf Hitler when I was 10 or 11 or something. I mean, I think I could barely read at that age, but so it was probably at about 14 or 15. But, you know, that's what mothers do, I suppose. She would tell us the story of her upbringing because she was a Holocaust survivor. She survived the Second World War as a Jew in occupied Vienna itself. And very, very few Jews survived. And she only survived because she was hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years. And whenever there was a Gestapo or SS raid in the area, she'd be rolled up in a carpet, and the carpet would be put up against the wall in case the SS and Gestapo managed to get into the sort of little square of houses they lived in and into the cellar they were hidden in. And in fact, I took my kids to see the cellar, and there are actually bullets in the door, not bullet holes. It was such thick steel that the bullets didn't go through them. And if it had been thinner steel, I wouldn't be here. My mother would not have survived. She lost dozens of her family in the Holocaust, mainly in Auschwitz, some also in Theresienstadt and 1 or 2 other camps. And I grew up with that as very much part of my upbringing. But an essential part of being a Holocaust survivor is the notion of never again. And so when I would ask my mom why she was going out at 6 o'clock in the morning with big pieces of cardboard that said strange things on them, she explained to me that never again isn't just about never again for Jews. It's about never again for all human beings, because all human beings are born equal. And that was probably the most profound influence on my life. And I obviously got to know an enormous amount about the Holocaust, about racism and its impacts, not just in the South African context, but in a global context. And I think we're seeing those impacts again over the past couple of months. And then I suppose it was primarily for that reason that I, from my teens, started working in townships and in squatter settlements, mainly around Cape Town. So Crossroads, Langa, Guguletu, Nyanga East, those sorts of areas where I worked. When I went to UCT, I ran a student welfare organization called Shawco. And we provided the relief operation in 1986 when 70,000 shacks were burned to the ground in Crossroads. And it was soon after that that I was called to the castle in Cape Town and told that my student deferment was not going to be extended, and that I needed to report to the infantry in Grahamstown, and that after my 3 months basic service, they would send me back to Crossroads, but in uniform. And I wasn't strong enough or courageous enough to go to prison as a conscientious objector, so I left the country. And I don't describe my time as being in exile, because I was, like I had been in South Africa, I was incredibly privileged. I studied at the University of California at Berkeley, and then I studied at Cambridge University here in the UK, which is where I met Simone, my wife. And we were actually married many years later in the King's College Chapel in Cambridge, where my daughter now studies in the same college. And we are, in the history of the college, which runs over 700 or 800 years, we are the only couple to be married there when neither of us were Christian. And so I suppose, my own personal journey has been one of understanding the evils of racism and inequality and injustice from a very young age. And then when I returned to the country, which I could do as soon as the ANC was unbanned and military service had been ended, I worked as a facilitator for something called the consultative business movement in our constitutional negotiations and various other processes, including after the awful massacre in Boipatong, I set up a reconciliation and reconstruction committee for the community there. I ran something called the Soweto Education Crisis Committee, the PWV Economic and Development Forum. And then in true ANC style, because after our marriage in the UK, we then had a ceremony in Abu Dhabi where my father-in-law lived, and in Bangladesh, where my wife's family are originally from. We had 3 weeks of receptions in which I put on 25 kilos, which I've never lost. And while I was in Bangladesh, I started getting messages from very irate people I'd worked with in these various facilitation processes. And of course, I worked at the World Trade Center as well in the main constitutional negotiations. And they were messages along the lines of, we thought you were a neutral facilitator, but all this time you were just an ANC mole. And I said, say what? And they would say, well, you're now an ANC candidate for parliament. So obviously you were just an ANC mole. And of course, the ANC hadn't even consulted me. And I landed up being elected just to the Gauteng legislature. I'm responsible for that name, so any of you who don't like it can blame me. Tokyo Sexwala wanted the province to be called Egoli, and there was a group of people who said we really can't be named after a soap opera. And so I was tasked with basically presenting to the ANC caucus why Gauteng was a much more appropriate name. And Tokyo and I then had to stand up in the caucus and we had to argue the two possible names. And before we'd even taken a vote, Tokyo conceded. But I cheated. I used a song of Hugh Masekela's to justify why it should be Gauteng and not Egoli. But I digress. In the Gauteng legislature, I chaired the Economics and Finance Committee. I also set up the Treasury in Gauteng, the Economic and Affairs Department, and actually landed up running them for the first few months. And I acted as Tokyo and Jabu Moleketi, who was our MEC for Finance, as their economic advisor. So I was playing three completely unconstitutional roles, where as chair of the committee, I was supposed to conduct oversight over the department that I helped set up and run, and over the executive who I was advising. But this reflected the sort of lack of skills we had in economics and finance in the early stages of our democracy. Then after about a year at the Davos Economic Forum where I was with Tokyo, Tokyo was called to see the president who just arrived. And he took me with him and I couldn't understand why I was being taken along. And I remember, first of all, what shocked me was the president was in this tiny hotel room. And there he was sitting in his yellow pajamas, and he and Tokyo had various stuff to talk about. And sort of almost by the by, he said to me, so Andrew, how do you feel about moving to Cape Town? So I said, well, sir, I would certainly consider it. I'm from Cape Town originally, but I would need to talk to my partner because she has a job in Johannesburg where we live. And he and Tokyo carried on talking. And then as we were leaving, he said to me, it's a good thing you're happy to go to Cape Town because you're being sworn in Parliament on Tuesday. And I was only due back in the country on the Thursday. So after a year, I was moved to the National Parliament when Marcel Golding left Parliament to set up the Trade Union Investment Trust. And I served on the Finance Committee, where I chaired the subcommittee that drafted the Public Finance Management Act, the act that our former president, Jacob Zuma, and excuse my language, urinated all over. But still, I think, an important piece of legislation. And I was then the ranking ANC member on the Public Accounts Committee, the main financial oversight committee. And in the year 2000, we received a report from the Auditor General about the fact that we'd spent $10 billion on weapons that the country didn't need and is barely used. And there was prima facie evidence of corruption. So we started an investigation of the case and discovered that there had been at least $350 million of corruption. And so we dealt with the matter as we normally did as the Public Accounts Committee. And then suddenly I started getting called in by all of the luminaries in the ANC to say, no, we won't be discussing this in Parliament. We'll be dealing with it privately in the party. And I disagreed. And so on the next available date, I was going to be removed from the parliamentary list. So I resigned the night before. And I wrote a book called After the Party, which was about that corruption deal. And then I've subsequently written a number of other books, the main one of which is something called The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, because I've spent the last 23 years investigating and researching how the arms trade corrupts our politics everywhere in the world and causes the sort of misery and immiseration that we've seen in Gaza for the last 2 months, while making certain people unbelievably wealthy. And so, you know, that is a focus that is not just on the arms trade per se, but on militarism and the way we live in the world and the nature of our politics. Why is this so important to me? Israel's relationship with South Africa is a very complex one. During those years of semigration, my parents used to take me to Israel. They were both strongly Zionist. And we would visit Yad Vashem, which was a shocking thing for a child to have to see, but it was a part of our family history, so it was incredibly important that I saw it. But I always felt quite uncomfortable in Israel. And I only really realized why when I went back slightly older. And it was because it reminded me of apartheid South Africa in so many ways. The racial divisions, the arrogance of people who think they are superior to other people, and a legislated system of separation based on race, ethnicity, religion, and nationality. So I suppose all of this comes to a head in the situation in Gaza and with South Africa's filing at the ICJ, which started today.
That felt like a bit of a trip down memory lane, and we were all hanging off you're a beautiful, wonderful storyteller. So Andrew, you're a Jew who is now standing against Israel. And I think if we can start there, because that's a real challenge. There are many people in South Africa who feel very strongly that the Jews have been given that land by God, and therefore they can do what they want, and we should just allow Israel to do what they want. And yet we've seen the consequence of that. So I'm interested to know, as a Jew, and I want to be very clear that we know that this is not Jew. The issue here is against the Israeli government. It's not against Jews, but Jewish people have struggled to deal with this, and we've all struggled to deal with it. So if you could just give us a little bit of your thoughts on just that story that we all grew up with.
Sure. So I think the first thing to say that's really important is that, I'm not unique in this respect. I think we sometimes forget, like on the BBC at lunchtime today, I was asked the question, the Jewish community of South Africa have said that this is a blood libel, that it's this, that it's that, that the other. I'll come back to some of that a bit later. And I had to say to her, it's not the Jewish community in South Africa. It's a segment of the Jewish community in South Africa. And it's a segment of the Jewish community globally. This notion that Israel represents all Jews and that all Jews have an affiliation for Israel and identify with the Israeli state is erroneous, and it's a very dangerous mistake that people make. And it's important to understand in Jewish history, which is a history of suffering. It's a history of thousands of years of suffering at the hands of various appalling regimes. The Jewish community anywhere on the planet, from the time Jews existed, has been broad, diverse, especially of political opinion. There's that old saying, you put two Jews in a telephone box. Oops.
Sorry. Sorry.
So I think someone has just unmuted themselves.
Yeah, it's fine.
There's the horrible old saying, and it applies not to Jews, it applies to a whole lot of other people as well. But there used to be this old saying that, you put two Jews in a telephone box and there'll be 12 different opinions and there'll be 15 arguments. And that's what the Jewish community is like. And it's one of the things I love about the Jewish community. And I should make it very clear to you that I am incredibly proud of my Judaism and of my history. I'm not a person of faith, but I don't believe that my identity as a Jew has to be exclusively about faith. I think it's as much about my social, political, and cultural upbringing as it is about religion and faith. And as long as there has been Jewish political thought, there has been this division in the Jewish community between those who have wanted a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland, and those Jews who are totally opposed to it. So Zionism and anti-Zionism. And, you know, the state of Israel today, and many of their supporters around the world who are not Jewish, describe Jewish anti-Zionists as anti-Semitic, as self-hating Jews, as all sorts of other ridiculous things. My children tell me that my problem is exactly the opposite of self-hating. But, you know, this sort of nonsense that somehow now you can only be defined as a Jew according to your views on the state of Israel. And if you in any way criticize the state of Israel, you're not a proper Jew. I mean, what sort of theology is that? It's absolutely terrifying. I know that I'm Jewish because my mother was Jewish. My father also happened to be Jewish. And I was brought up as a Jew, and I live as a Jew, and I'm incredibly proud of that. I am not incredibly proud of the state of Israel. I fully understand why the state of Israel exists. And I don't believe it's for biblical reasons, I'm afraid to say. I do not believe that invoking scripture is an appropriate or sufficient reason to justify the existence of a nation state on a particular piece of land. Because if we want to use scripture and history in that way, then unfortunately everybody who lives in Britain today will have to leave, and we'll have to give it back to Italians who were Romans, because they were the original inhabitants here. And if one looks at DNA studies that came to light quite a few years ago now, it's absolutely clear that the people who originated in what is today Israel and Palestine were one Semitic people. And so even to use the word anti-Semitic against Jew, just identifying it as hatred of Jews. And don't get me wrong, anti-Semitism is a huge problem in the world, just as is Islamophobia, just as is anti-Black racism and all forms of discrimination. But anti-Semitism, in its true definition, can actually mean hatred of Semitic people, and Palestinians are Semitic people. So it's massively misused. So why do I have issues with the state of Israel? Well, first of all, in 1948, when the state was created, it wasn't created in isolation. You know, it's not like Jan van Riebeeck turned up in South Africa and there was no one there. And therefore it was fine for him to say the land belonged to him and the Dutch. Because Israel was created in parallel with something called the Nakba, the suffering, in which millions of Palestinian people were forced off their land that they had occupied for generations and generations and generations, and were sent into exile, lost everything that they possessed. Somewhere between 700,000 and a million Palestinians were killed in the creation of the state of Israel. And Israel's first political leaders, all the way up to Menachem Begin, very proudly described themselves as terrorists. They belonged to something called the Haganah, which was a terrorist grouping, which wanted to get the British out of Palestine so that they could turn it into an Israeli state. And that is what led to the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain gave away territory that it had absolutely no right to give away, like it does or did in so many parts of the world. It's why I have very little respect for people in this country where I live who accept honors from the royal family, which are called things like Order of the British Empire or Master of the British Empire, because the British Empire was built on the backs of the murder and displacement of tens of millions of people around the world. And history isn't just written by people like me who have pale skins, what my daughter thinks is pink skin. History has to be written by the indigenous people that inhabited the world from the day of creation. So Israel is a particular manifestation of this. And if Jews wanted to settle in Palestine, and believe you me, given that my own family lost dozens, we're not sure of the exact number, we think it's around 39 people, in the concentration camps of the Holocaust. Some of my extended family who survived the death camps thought they'd lost all of their family and made their way to Palestine. It wasn't yet Israel, and discovered that, for instance, their mother or father or brother or sister had also made their way to Palestine, and they discovered they still had family in this world. So I can understand the desire and the need for the creation of this state. What I don't understand is the need to push out the people who lived on that land at that point. Because as we took over 350 years in South Africa to figure out, it is possible for different people to live harmoniously together. It's not necessarily easy, but nothing in life is. But it is possible, and it is desirable, because if we don't learn to live together as people with all sorts of differences, you know, I see some of you here who've got a lot of hair. Difficult for a bald person. I feel envious. When it's very windy in Cape Town, I feel advantaged. Can I get on with people who have a lot of hair? Of course I can, because it's as important as the color of your eyes, the color of your skin, or your height. So the tragedy is that the people who created the state of Israel decided that they had to expel the Palestinians from their historic land in order to do so, and that they didn't want to live side by side with them. So, and that is what leads us to today, sadly.
Yeah, Andrew, and what's been interesting for me in talking to many people about it is there are still many people who believe that Israel, when they hear things like Andrew says Israel is an apartheid state, and not just you, many others, they go, oh, he doesn't really understand. Israel is a very loving community. They want to live with their neighbors. They have given their neighbors Gaza, and it is such a wonderful place. You know, it's like, so tell us your experience. Why have you said, someone sent a question and said, how the heck can Andrew say that the apartheid in Gaza is worse than in South Africa? Because South Africa was brutal. How can we say that it's more brutal? So why did you say that?
Let me first of all be clear. I am probably the least significant person who has called Israel an apartheid state. All right. So let's get on to the far more important people who have described it as an apartheid state. And I'm going to go in order of their importance. First of all, I'm going to mention President Jimmy Carter, who was the only president in the history of the United States of America who did not take his country into conflict, which isn't a bad starting point. So some people might think he was a rubbish president and a peanut farmer. But at least people weren't killed in his name in the 4 years that he was president, which is probably why the Americans didn't re-elect him. He has written 2 books giving theoretical, legal, and academic justification for why Israel is an apartheid state. Okay? I am not qualified to be the small toe on Jimmy Carter's left foot. But then people far more important than Jimmy Carter, who I've known and who I've had the enormous privilege to work with in my life, have identified Israel as an apartheid state. One of them, some of you might have heard of. His name's Nelson Mandela. The other one you might have heard of too, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. These are two of the most remarkable human beings the world has seen ever. And you know, as someone who only benefited from being a privileged white person under apartheid, to have the honor of knowing those people is something that I'll be thankful for till the moment I die. And why did they call it an apartheid state? Very, very simple. First of all, they understand apartheid, or understood apartheid far better than I ever did, because I had to try and understand it from the perspective of a privileged white person in a system that was built around my privilege. Mandela and Tutu and tens of millions of other South Africans understood it from the position of being brutally oppressed by a white supremacist state. First of all, citizens of Israel are defined by their religion and ethnicity. And that definition determines what rights they have within the state of which they are citizens. So a Palestinian Israeli, and yes, there are such things, a Palestinian Israeli does not have the same voting rights as an Israeli Jew, does not have the same rights of property as an Israeli Jew, does not have the same rights under the law as an Israeli Jew. In other words, their basic civil rights are lesser than a Jewish Israeli citizen. You know what the most remarkable thing is? As a Jew, I have the right to go to Israel and to immediately become a citizen of that country at the airport when I land. A Palestinian living 15 kilometers from Tel Aviv, or 2 or 3 kilometers from the center of Jerusalem, does not have that same right. So you have you have Israeli Palestinians who are actually citizens of Israel, who have lesser rights. That, in terms of the Rome Statute, which is a piece of international law, determines legally that Israel is an apartheid state according to the internationally legally accepted definition of apartheid. What makes it even more of an apartheid state is that there are parts of what was historic Palestine, what we understand as Gaza and broadly the West Bank, which comprises a whole lot of different areas. These were part of historic Palestine. And by international law, they are part of Palestine. Israel illegally occupies both Gaza and the West Bank, again, in terms of international law and in terms of the Charter of the United Nations. So Israel militarily governs Palestinian territory. And the Palestinians have to pass through military checkpoints, not just to get from their Palestinian territory into Israel or back, but even to get from one part of their Palestinian territory to another part of those territories. And those checkpoints are the most dehumanizing things I have ever seen in my life, where you have 17 and 18-year-old Israeli boys and girls in uniform with very powerful weapons, treating Palestinians of all ages worse than animals. I have witnessed and experienced that myself. I have spent a lot of time in Israel and in the occupied territories. In addition to which, Israel is responsible for the flow of water into the occupied territories, for the maintenance of electricity in those occupied territories, and can blockade those territories at any time that it decides, all illegally. And Gaza in particular has been under a blockade for just over 30 years. So Israel determines what can go into and what can come out of Gaza. And in Israel itself, Palestinians have zero rights. In Palestine even, they have very limited rights, because at any time the occupying power can take away not only their most basic rights to food, to shelter, to safety, to an education, but they can remove the most sacred of all rights, the right to life.
So
These are
Andrew,
the things that make it an apartheid state. But what is worse, sorry, if I could just finish one very other quick point. The entire system, and you only experience this if you travel both in Israel and the occupied territories, not just in Israel. Because Israel is a lot like apartheid South Africa. You can be in Tel Aviv and you think you're in one of the great cities of the world, and you can go for days and days and days without seeing a Palestinian person, and you can talk to Israeli Jews who have never met a Palestinian, who live a few kilometers away from them. And the only way that takes place is on the basis that Israelis see themselves as superior to Palestinians, and they enforce that superiority in every aspect of life every day. And that is why Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu both described Israeli apartheid as far worse than South African apartheid, because in South Africa during the apartheid years, the apartheid state required the cheap labor of the vast majority of South Africa's people, who were people of color, and therefore couldn't wipe them all out. Israel does not have the same economic requirement of the people of Palestine, and therefore, as we are seeing in Gaza today, is willing to commit genocide against them.
So Andrew, I mean, thank you. This is so helpful for all of us to hear this. One of the things that I got interested over the last 90 days just in the background, because I realized I just didn't know enough about the history, and I've realized that the feeling of being attacked in Gaza is not something that started on the 8th of October, that it has been a very long period of time. So when you talk to Jewish people who are, or sorry, to people who are pro-Israel and want to be defending of Israel, they say, no, but you know, the Israelis has left Gaza. Gaza has self-determination. Gaza can, which is not the truth, but it's a story that's being spun. And but I mean, this kind of feeling of being at risk physically as a human being has been the reality of most people in Gaza for the last 50 years.
Yeah. So it is really important. You're quite right. It's really, really important to understand that, you know, the tragic, awful events of 7th of October were somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 Israelis were murdered. There's no getting away from that. Unfortunately, a few of them, it would now appear, were actually killed by Israeli forces who decided to fire on houses, buildings, and strategic territories that the Hamas insurgents had occupied. But what happened on 7th of October has to be understood in the context of the 70-year history of the Nakba, and has to be understood in the context of the 30-year blockade of Gaza. What is this equivalent to? It's equivalent to the apartheid state in South Africa, First of all, saying to all South Africans who were Xhosa, you have to live in Ciskei and Transkei. So sorry that there's so many of you, but you're just going to have to squash into this place. Gaza is the first or second most densely populated place on this planet. Then, once you're in the Ciskei and the Transkei, if you want to go and see your relatives from the Ciskei to the Transkei, you'll have to go through a military checkpoint where we'll decide whether you can or not. And on some days, we just don't feel like it. On other days, I don't know, you're not looking at me nicely enough, so you're not going. Or on that day, yeah, maybe you can go. And then when you come back at night from seeing your relatives, we decide, actually, no, we don't like you. You're going to have to sleep out in the open here. We're not letting you back into your home. And then the South African Defence Force, as it was, drops bombs on you and decides that actually you don't need water for all of the people who are there, so we'll give you enough water for 30% of you. And oh, now you want to bring a whole lot of medication in because the 70% of you who don't have clean drinking water are now ill. Yeah, well, some of that medication could be used for purposes we don't like, so we're not giving that to you either. That's what the reality of life in Gaza is like. So why do so many of us not understand this? Very, very simple. First of all, the first victim in any conflict is the truth, even before the first person has been killed. And this I've learned in 23 years that I've studied warfare, conflict, genocide, and the arms trade that fuels it. And in the case of our political leaders, and sadly, this applies to virtually all political leaders all over the world. We are at a particular nadir, a low point of politics everywhere. If you think politics in South Africa is bad, come and visit me in the United Kingdom, where we also have a billionaire prime minister, except that when he declares sanctions on Russia, quite correctly, for its invasion of the Ukraine, he excludes his wife's family, who run a multi-billion-pound corporation, because Russia is their biggest customer. And 2 days before he's about to make an announcement that has huge market implications, his family divest of all of their holdings in the companies affected. And he replaced the prime minister, who we knew was lying, when his lips moved, who gave tens of billions of pounds to his various mistresses as government contracts, including, listen to this, 39 billion pounds to create a track and trace app during COVID, an app that never ever worked because that particular mistress had never worked in telecommunications or in the health sector. And have we got 1 penny of that money back? Of course not.
You're making Zuma look good.
Oh, exactly. You know, and I'm supposed to be giving evidence at Zuma's never happening corruption trial. We do a lot of work on state capture. We worked with the Zondo Commission. My colleague Paul Holden's produced a book on state capture. I'll stop this tangent in a second. Our next state capture project is on the United Kingdom under Boris Johnson. And it's going to make South Africa's state capture and Gupta and the Zumas, who were terrible and awful and corrupt and thugs, it's going to make them look like kids.
So Andrew, I want to come back.
All of these politicians are pretty awful. Sorry, just one more thing. And the thing that they do most of all is what a brilliant Palestinian intellectual called Edward Said described. And I used this in front of my first book, After the Party, which was about the arms deal in the ANC. Said described power repeating untruths until they have the force of truth. And the thing that the Israeli state is best at is military technology on the one hand and propaganda on the other hand. Over the past 10 or 12 years, Israel very consciously, as the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel started getting a lot of momentum around the world, and the Israelis were so close to apartheid South Africa, which we haven't even touched on, that they knew what ended apartheid in South Africa. And they knew that the BDS movement was absolutely crucial in ending apartheid in South Africa. They created a ministry called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And its brief was to ensure that everybody who criticized the state of Israel, everybody who supported BDS, any form of boycott, divestment, or sanctions against Israel, was labeled an anti-Semite. Whether they were Jewish or not Jewish, whether they were Holocaust survivors or not, they were all anti-Semites. And that's why we have this madness that today everybody thinks that all Jews are uncritical of the state of Israel, and that the state of Israel represents all Jews, and that to criticize the state of Israel is to be anti-Semitic, because the state of Israel has very consciously set out to do that. So this is really important to understand in the context of why a lot of us haven't understood the enormity of what goes on in the occupied territories, because Israel and its allies, who are the most powerful countries in the world, have been telling us for decades and decades that that isn't the real situation. And they think South Africa today, they have said that South Africa has just been telling untruths at the ICJ.
So the problem with that, their position, is that a lot of what South Africa was saying in the ICJ this morning was live streamed for 96 days onto our phones, and we had, you know, we all have the footage and the documentation of it. But something that and there's been a few questions in similar veins, something that's been breaking my brain over the last 96 days is how it is possible for Biden and Blinken and the whole of the USA and the UK to just, I mean, we saw the UK Labour Party were in Israel for a solidarity mission in the last few days. How is it possible that intelligent, powerful people can be so beholden to Israel? I mean, I've started to think, you know, all of the conspiracy theories about Mossad and Epstein, and, you know, do they have a file on each of them? What's the story? How the heck does that happen?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you know, Jeffrey Epstein, who did a lot of work in the arms trade. So in our arms deal, Prince Andrew and Tony Blair effectively facilitated the bribes paid to our politicians, senior officials, and the head of the South African National Defense Force, okay? Whether Jeffrey Epstein was involved as well or not, I do not know. But in a lot of the arms deals that I've investigated around the world for the last 23 years, Epstein has been brought in to provide his very unique services to the buyers, be they members of the Saudi royal family, be they members of many of the world's governments, etc., etc. And that's one of the ways in which he made a whole lot of money. And some people claim that he was a Mossad agent. Who the hell knows? I mean, you know, I certainly don't. And it's not the sort of information that one can verify, because no intelligence agency, very badly named, by the way, no intelligence agency on the planet will reveal any of their assets. Most of the arms dealers that I interview around the world are assets of multiple intelligence agencies, just like Joe Modise was. When we were in exile, it's estimated that Modise was on the books of 12 or 13 different, often competing intelligence agencies, which is why he was always so corrupt. But that's another digression. So why is it that these countries are so beholden to Israel? It's a number of factors. So in the United States of America, there was a time that I can remember, Ronald Reagan, very right-wing president of the United States of America, had no time for Israel. But the Jewish lobby in the United States of America is incredibly powerful politically. What do I mean by the Jewish lobby? Is this some sort of slur? Well, no, it's not. There's a brilliant book written by two Jewish American academics at Harvard University that came out, I don't know, almost 20 years ago, called The Jewish Lobby. It's called AIPAC. And it is a political committee to promote the interests of Israel. And what it does is it provides, which is perfectly legal, it provides money to politicians for their political campaigns in the United States of America. And because it is one of the 2 or 3 best funded political committees in the United States of America, it has the ability to pay off far more politicians than other lobbies. The Saudi lobby is now becoming as powerful. And that's one of the reasons why Saudi and Israel is seeing a much closer diplomatic relationship. And they were about to sign a series of accords just before the 7th of October. Now the Saudi royal family fear that if they sign these accords with Israel, their population will actually kick them out. So they can't. So Israel has enormous influence in what I would call Western politics through, unfortunately, the power of money and the power of lobbying. Why do I say, unfortunately, the power of money? Because anti-Semites throughout history have tried to associate Jews with money. Now, like any other community, there are many, many poor Jews, many Jews who haven't made a lot of money. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews, some ultra-Orthodox groups of Jews have a biblical injunction to produce as large a family as possible. So they have families sometimes of 12, 15 kids. And even if they're doing incredibly well, they often don't live particularly opulent lives because they have so many mouths to feed. This notion that all Jews are wealthy is an anti-Semitic trope. There are many Jews who are not. And the Nazis used to depict Jews as these people with huge noses who had dollar signs dripping off them. That's why it's seen as an anti-Semitic trope. But Israel does use money, finance, as does Saudi Arabia, as does the United Arab Emirates, etc., etc. There are many countries who do this, to buy politicians in other countries. So in the United Kingdom, we know that there was a guy in the Israeli embassy who was eventually dismissed from the embassy who had given £1 million to a small group of Labour politicians to establish something called Labour Friends of Israel, because the Labour Party was quite antagonistic towards Israel. And some of the Labour Friends of Israel were the people that you saw in the picture, Louise, visiting the Israeli president, I think yesterday. And interesting, one of them, Jewish, has a family business that made tens of millions of pounds out of acting as an agent for the apartheid South African state, but that's another story. And effectively what they have done is they have made political parties in the Western countries incredibly scared of falling foul of Israel because they have become politically and diplomatically very, very powerful. So my own constituency MP, Keir Starmer, who claims to be a human rights lawyer, but won't support a ceasefire in Gaza, leader of the Labour Party, supposed to be a democratic socialist party, when asked whether he thinks Israel have violated international law, says he's a politician, he can't judge. He was a human rights lawyer. He was head of the Crown Prosecution Services for a number of years. It's the most disingenuous statement by a politician I've heard in a long time, because he is terrified, because the Jewish Board of Deputies here was absolutely central with something called the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism in getting rid of the previous Labour leader, who was a guy called Jeremy Corbyn, who was very, very critical of Israel and who was very supportive of the Palestinians. So Israel has this power in domestic politics in Western countries. And then there are other Western countries like Germany and Austria, where my mom was from, who will support anything and everything that Israel does because of their historical guilt about the Holocaust. So while Biden takes a lot of money from AIPAC, I should just mention, Keir Starmer recently received the biggest ever individual donation in the history of Britain's Labour Party, £5 million. The person is a South African based in London called Gary Lubner, son of Bertie Lubner, who started the Plate Glass Group. Gary Lubner has no interest in the British Labour Party. His only political interest is in trying to ensure that there is no criticism of Israel. So this is how Israel exerts such influence over particularly the West. And it's not just the political dimension of Western states, but it is also the media. You'll find very few media publications who will actually print damning criticisms of Israel. And it's part of the problem of why there is such ignorance about the situation in Israel.
So Andrew, we've got half an hour left, and I want to move it to a little bit more of a hopeful thought about, well, we want to hear your thoughts about today, but one of the things that I am curious about, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts, is over the last 96 days, we've had these journalists. It is heartbreaking how many of them were killed by Israel. I mean, that just is just, but we did have footage and information from the ground. And so those of us who were interested in what was going on got that information. And so there's a very large percentage of aware young people who are fed up. And so if you look at all of the pro-Palestine marches and anti-genocide marches that were happening around the world, and you know, I'm wondering, I saw you and Jeremy Corbyn are kind of plotting a plan. I'm wondering whether there isn't hope for a real shift, that the traditional media, the power that came from the media and the politicians, is being eroded by social media and citizen journalism and young people who are just saying, not in our name, we will no longer allow this. And it's much more visible, and it's much more kind of open. And then I'd love you to talk about what happened today. What did you see in
Sure. So look, I think the problem that Israel has, and the reason they targeted journalists, of whom 109 died last time I heard, it's, you know, I don't know what the number is now, it's probably a couple more than that today. Why would a country with the most sophisticated precision-guided munitions kill journalists and their families? Well, it's on a greater scale what I experienced in Crossroads in 1986, when the apartheid state burned down 70,000 shacks, and I took 20 students from UCT in our Shawko relief vehicle in there. They wouldn't let us out because they didn't want Cape Townians, let alone South Africans or the rest of the world, to know what they had just done to their own people. That's exactly what Israel thought it could do. If it got rid of the journalists on the ground in Gaza, who was going to tell the story of what was happening there, which shows the ineptitude of the Israeli state. Because in the social media age, one has citizen journalists, where virtually everyone can be a journalist. So, and that's a source of great hope. And, you know, it's awful to talk about silver linings in a situation like this. When you hear the evidence that South Africa presented today, and let me just say, I've spent 23 years of researching and investigating conflict and warfare around the world, and it hasn't been pleasant. But never in my lifetime did I expect to see what I have seen for the last 2 months and 4 days, every single day, where genocide is committed in front of the entire world. And the most powerful people in the world, actively and consciously, not only arm the perpetrators of that genocide, and in the process make billions of dollars for themselves, we should mention, but speak out in their defense uncritically. Because there is no defense. And it's going to be fascinating tomorrow to hear the Israeli defense, because self-defense is not a form of defense under international law for an occupying power. And I'll tell you what the nature of their defense is going to be. This is what the Israeli embassy in Berlin put out as South Africa finished its extraordinary presentation today that really represented the best of our nation in every possible respect. The Israeli embassy in Berlin said, "Today we witnessed one of the greatest hypocrisies in history, made worse by a series of false and unsubstantiated claims. South Africa, the legal arm of the terrorist organization Hamas, so as long as you all know that, completely distorts the reality in Gaza after the October 7 massacre and ignores the fact that Hamas terrorists are infiltrating Israel, murdered, executed, massacred, raped, and kidnapped Israeli citizens. They were victims because they were Israelis. It was Hamas who wanted to commit genocide." Now, it's a little bit like, I'm afraid to say, and I say this with all due respect, the chief rabbi and the Israeli government spokesperson describing what South Africa has done as blood libel, as humiliating itself internationally, as lies, as acting as agents for Iran or for Hamas. Look, there are aspects of South Africa's foreign policy that I don't like, and I'm sure there are aspects that you don't like. But to call us the legal agent of the Iranian government or the legal agent of Hamas is, I'm afraid to say, intellectually embarrassing. Now, when Israel resorts to describing what South Africa has done in trying to stop them with this continuing genocide in the highest international court in the world, describes that as a blood libel, which is how it would use, it's the terminology it would use to describe Nazi actions, etc., and various other things. I mean, this has gone to a point of basic depravity that would be funny if it wasn't so incredibly tragic, because this is coming from a state that every day is killing on average 247 people, 47 of whom are women, 117 are children. If it wasn't coming from a government who, as the South African case made so clear this morning, from the Prime Minister down, from the head of the military down, has been saying, we will erase Gaza and everybody in it from the map. That is the intent of genocide. And what they have done on the ground every day is the conduct of genocide. And you know what? Sorry, I think someone's just unmuted themselves. The problem is that the fact that genocide was committed against the Jewish people, including against my own family, doesn't give anybody, Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, people of no faith, the right to in turn commit genocide. And to use the suffering of the 12 million people who were slaughtered by the Nazis to justify the slaughter of innocent Palestinians is really a shame on the memory of those 12 million people. And I'm sorry if I sound overly emotional saying this, but it is around 39 members of my own family whose names are being used to justify seeing Palestinian babies bombed in hospitals, Palestinian babies having an arm or a leg amputated without anesthetic because Israel has destroyed the entire health infrastructure of Gaza. To use the memory and the names of those people to justify this, what Jews should be doing, and if Israel regards itself as a Jewish state, what it should be doing is ensuring that what happened to the victims of the Shoah never happens to another human being again, rather than being the perpetrators of actions very similar to that. So where does the hope come from? And again, I must apologize for drawing any silver lining from so appalling and tragic a situation. But the silver lining is the world is waking up to the reality of how the state of Israel behaves and the way in which it treats the Palestinian people. And our politicians, every single one of them, who has refused to support a ceasefire, who has continued to support against our own domestic laws throughout the Western world and against international law, including the International Arms Trade Treaty, who continues to provide the weapons so tomorrow Israel can continue to kill another 247 Palestinians. All of those people should face the legal consequences of their action. I'll tell you what they will face. They are going to face the political and moral consequences of their actions. Every single weekend, in the area that I live in, we hold a rally outside the office of our MP, Keir Starmer, who will probably be the next Prime Minister of Britain, because he shamefully will not call for a ceasefire, encourages the continuing transportation of British weapons to ensure this conflict can continue. And he doesn't have the guts to say that as a human rights lawyer, what Israel is doing is a violation of international law.
Sorry,
So
here's another
I
person.
like.
the fact that millions of people, tens of millions of people all over the world are turning out week after week in ever bigger demonstrations to protest against what their governments are doing. In the Western world, people who have lived here far longer than I have cannot remember a time when all of their politicians, not just their governments, but when all of their politicians felt so out of sync with the vast, vast majority of people in their countries. 76% of Britons wanted an immediate ceasefire on the 9th of October. None of our senior politicians have called for one. Keir Starmer's Labour Party has seen its support amongst Muslim Britons since the 7th of October drop from 71% to 5%. These awful atrocities are going to have consequences for our politics all over the world for years and years, for generations to come. And you know what the impact might be in South Africa? Because South Africa has been recognized on the world stage again today as actually having an important history when it comes to how the rest of the world functions. And you know, I'm sure many of you would have thought those days were over, when on the world stage we could be proud to be South Africans again, like we were in '94 and for the 4 or 5 years after that. And perhaps this response will inspire our politicians, who have been remarkably inept, corrupt, and unaccountable for decades now. Maybe it will inspire them and remind them what it is we created in 1994 and what it is that they owe to the people of South Africa.
So, Andrew, oh my word, I can spend the whole day listening to you, and I'm sure everybody else. And we did have a plan to say we'll have a conversation and then we'll invite other people. But it really, I've been keeping an eye on the questions and what people have been asking. And we've got 15 minutes left. So I'm going to ask for you to just, the fear is that somehow Israel has managed to corrupt the judges, and that there will be no action taken, which anybody who saw that, by the way, for those of you who've not been able to watch the footage of today's submission, it will change your life. There's no doubt about it if you watched it. But anybody who saw today, I don't know, none of us can imagine a future where that is not taken seriously. But we don't know, because there is so much corruption and there is so much so much power being wielded. So give us the best case outcome from tomorrow, and then we're all going to hold on to that as a possibility.
Can I just respond to, there's a whole thread of questions around the issue of, but Hamas is an anti-Semitic organization. So first of all, let me say, I can't speak for Hamas. I don't know what Hamas is or isn't. I don't particularly like its modus operandi. You know, I got involved with the ANC in the mid-1980s. The ANC was committed to armed struggle. I didn't particularly agree with or like all aspects of the way in which the ANC waged struggle, but I'm incredibly proud to have been a part of that struggle and to have been a part of our first two democratic parliaments. Do you want to ask every baby, every child, every innocent man and woman in Gaza, before you bomb them or kill them with a sniper's bullet, what their view is of Israel, what their view is of Hamas, and whether Israel has the right to exist or not? That is not the way in which the world functions. It is illegal under international law to impose collective punishment on a people. Hamas did win an election many years ago in Gaza. I'm not sure of the exact amount of people who voted for it, but even if, and this isn't the case, even if 99.9% of them had voted for Hamas, that still doesn't give Israel the right to invoke collective punishment against everybody who is a resident of Gaza. And let me tell you the only way in which you can justify what Israel is doing, and this is why it has such resonance for South Africa.
Can I have a comment, please?
This is why it's so important for South Africa. Between 1,500 and 2,000 Israeli lives were lost. And each one of those lives was sacred. As of yesterday, 23,000 Palestinian lives have been lost. It will be more today. And each one of those lives was sacred. And if you think that an Israeli Jewish life is worth more than a Palestinian Muslim, Christian, or person of no faith life, if you believe that 23,000 isn't yet enough in vengeance for the Israeli lives that were lost, then I'm afraid you are a racial supremacist. And that is how apartheid was established in South Africa. And that is the basis of apartheid in Israel. Because unless we view every single human life as of equal value, we might as well give up as a human race. Because we cannot live on this planet together. And what Israel is doing, if the court finds against South Africa, the terrifying thing is that the rule of international law will be dead. So that when Joe Biden or Rishi Sunak quite correctly criticize Vladimir Putin and Russia for the Russian bombing of residential areas in Ukraine, of hospitals in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will turn around and say, but this is exactly what you have allowed the Israelis to do in Gaza and to a lesser extent the West Bank. And it means that any country can attack any other territory that it wants to, in any other way that it wants to, where human life has no value anymore. When the United States of America, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, etc., 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 are as bad as any brutal, informal militia that commits acts of violence against anyone it happens to want to. It will be the rule of anarchy, and it will be the end of the world as we know it. That is the seriousness of the decision facing the judges. And I only hope that they are able to withstand the immense political pressure they are under, particularly from the United States on behalf of Israel, but also from a lot of other Western nations, and that they are able to rule in favor of South Africa. And what will happen then is that the court will issue an interim order, hopefully within a week, that will instruct Israel to stop its military actions in Gaza. It is about 99.9% certain that Israel will ignore that injunction from the highest court on the planet. It then becomes incredibly difficult for America, Britain, and the other Israeli allies to continue to provide military support, political and diplomatic support to Israel in what it is doing. Joe Biden, who has probably already sacrificed the next election and is going to gift to the world another 4 years of the genius that is Donald Trump. And I hope you all get that I'm being ironic. Joe Biden will not survive as American president for the rest of his term if he continues to actively enable and facilitate a genocide after the International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel has to stop its activities in Gaza. Nor will Rishi Sunak, nor will any of the Western leaders. It'll become so much more difficult for them to do what they are currently doing. So that is the best case scenario. But more than that, in contrast to the worst case scenario, it'll be a decision that'll give us hope again that we can restore the global rule of law so that Israel can be punished in just the same way Russia should be punished, in just the same way Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and everyone who has armed them for the 8 years of the conflict in Yemen, in which war crimes have been constantly committed, in exactly the same way that they should suffer the legal consequences of their action. That is the responsibility that befalls those judges tomorrow and over the week after that.
So, Andrew, we normally end these kind of conversations with lots of words of appreciation, but I'm going to ask people to put that in the WhatsApp group so that if you want to appreciate what you've experienced today, that Andrew will he'll be able to read it afterwards. I have a challenge for you, Andrew. You had the privilege to work with Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Tutu and many other wonderful leaders who are part of South Africa's very difficult but beautiful history in some ways. And what would they, and I mean, what were your thoughts to all of us? So I've been counseled over the last 96 days that I should be very aware, I should be careful to be so vocal, and we should, you know, not say so much, and we should be neutral, and we shouldn't take such a strong stance. And I don't think that, I think this is the time for us to take a stance, and people like you and Owen and other people have inspired the rest of us. But what do you think? What should we be doing in this time? And what is the call to us as citizens who care about a just future?
You need to be incredibly supportive. And I know this is difficult, but you need to be incredibly supportive of what the South African government has done. It's incredibly important. And you need to invoke the moral position that they have taken in everything else that they do going forward. And then you need to get out on the streets, get onto social media in support of the people of Palestine. If you cannot speak out loudly about the killing of babies who are a few days old, be they killed because their incubators didn't have electricity, be they killed because they happened to be born in a hospital or a home that was bombed indiscriminately. If you cannot speak out about that, what can you speak out about? And let me remind you, I'm an ordinary citizen.
Sorry, we've got someone unmuted again. Let me just mute them quickly. Oh, goodness, sorry. Few people here, got them all muted. Okay, sorry, Andrew.
I am an ordinary citizen of the United Kingdom and South Africa. I would like to regard myself as a citizen of the world. As citizens of a single country or of the planet, we have responsibilities. And the most basic responsibility is to be an active citizen. Is to not say, oh yeah, you know, there is everything that is created so that I can live the life I live. And I know, you know, I'd like a lot of things to be different and better. But I do vote every time there's an election, or most times there's an election. You know, that makes me incredibly active. That's not being an active citizen. It's about getting out there, voicing your opinions, explaining to your representatives what your opinions are and what you will and won't support. And if there are no representatives out there who support your point of view, do what Zaki Ahmed is doing. Stand as an independent candidate. If our politicians are all useless, and the vast majority of them across the world at the moment, unfortunately, are, you know, the very worst of people go into politics nowadays. They see it as a money-making exercise. Then let's replace them with just ordinary citizens. Politicians aren't special people. You know, Mandela came into the ANC caucus once and he said, who here thinks you important? Some people didn't realize that it was a rhetorical question and they put up their hands. And he said, as soon as you think you are more important than the people who put you here and the people who pay your salary, you are of no use to this movement, you're of no use to this parliament, you're of no use to this country. And he was exactly right. And that's why Nelson Mandela stopped and spoke to every single person he walked past, which is why he was so late for everything. Because he saw himself as an ordinary person, which he was. And ordinary people can be extraordinary. And so we have to go out as ordinary people and we have to do extraordinary things. And when you call it by, you know, being cancelled, I mean, anybody who uses that sort of rhetoric really needs to look in a mirror. I mean, for goodness sake, if someone wants to cancel somebody else because they speak out about the barbarism that is taking place in Gaza at the moment in our names, then I'm afraid to say they should keep to themselves, they should keep incredibly quiet, they shouldn't get out of bed in the morning, at night, or at any time at all. It's those people who speak out, who do something to make the world a better place. And that's why, what is the point of waking up? What is the point of our being able to live where all of those Palestinian children had no life? It is so that we can make the people around us, be they family or friends, our community, our society, our country, and our world a better place. And we do that through little actions, through all of our everyday actions, and we do it through massive political actions. We all have agency. Let's use that agency in the name of the things that have made South Africa a democracy, albeit an imperfect one. Justice, equality, mutual respect for every human being.
Thank you, Andrew. You have inspired us. You have brought a smile to our face. You've made us angry, which is always important in these kind of moments. We will remain tuned to what you and everybody else is saying. And for everybody on the call, I wanted to say, join our WhatsApp groups tomorrow. We're going to be glued to the screen for those 3.5 hours and seeing what's going on in The Hague. And let's use this positive energy that we have seen in the last few days to create the country that we are all so proud of. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. Really, thank you for your yes to when I made contact. It's been amazing to have you.
Thank you for
Thank you, everybody.
all the best.
Thank you.